Welcome to Iron Sharpens Iron. My name is Jeremy Nettles. I'm the evangelist for the River Ridge Church of Christ that meets in Newburgh, Indiana. If you would like to join us for our Sunday morning worship, you can find us at 5600 Van Road. We meet at 10 a.m. on Sundays. We also have a Bible study that begins at 9 before that as well. And then we offer a 4 p.m. afternoon service as well. You're also welcome to get in touch with us by phone at 812-550-6234 or email info@riverridgechurch.org. And I encourage you to check out our YouTube channel, youtube.com/River Ridge Church of Christ. All of these TV shows go up on there after they have aired on Fox locally. But you can also find our live-streamed worship services there, and that's a great way for you to participate with us if you are a little too far away to visit us in person. We're going to start out today in 1 John chapter 3, beginning in verse 12. We should not be like Cain, who was of the evil one, and murdered his brother. And why did he murder him? Because his own deeds were evil, and his brother's righteous. Do not be surprised, brothers, that the world hates you. When we read a passage like this, one of the things that strikes us is just how obvious it is. We all basically know this. Well, first of all, we know that we shouldn't murder our brothers. I suppose that should go without saying. But that's not really what I'm getting at. I'm talking about the latter part, verse 13, where after drawing a distinction between Cain and Abel and calling back to that story in Genesis 4 about how Cain murdered his brother over, well, for us to look at it, it seems like it's nothing. But as John points out here, it really just comes down to the fact that he was of the evil one. And his deeds were evil, and his brother Abel's deeds were righteous, and being evil, he resented his brother's righteousness and desired to do him harm. It really does come down to that. We could try to delve into the depths of Cain's psyche and explain a lot of the reasons behind why he did what he did, but fundamentally it comes down to, well, it's simple as this. The evil resent and hate the righteous and seek to harm them. Now, as I said, this seems like it should go without saying. We basically all know this intuitively. And yet it requires, well, it requires some of our attention, and especially when we think about what it means today. Because we're not just talking about sort of an archaic Old Testament notion of righteousness and wickedness as if it's that simple. Now we've got God's chosen people, His elect, His church, and the world. And the church is a relatively small part of that world, and it's not even of the world. And so what John is getting at here is not just that those who broadly do evil things will hate those who broadly do righteous things, but specifically about the church. Those who are not in the church, those who are of the world instead, will hate the church. And they'll hate every member of it. Even if they don't put it in those terms, even if they don't say it, even if they don't really understand that or admit it to themselves, that's what it comes down to. There's a specific animosity toward the church. And we should not be surprised at it. John says to an audience toward the end of the 1st century A.D., do not be surprised that the world hates you. We actually read this passage last week on the show as we were going through all 3 of John's letters here. And not just here, but other places, we get hints at it elsewhere in the letter, and certainly other places in the New Testament, we are warned to expect that the world is going to hate those who follow Jesus. Sometimes I've even seen passages like this serve as a bit of a wake-up call for Christians, because, well, here I am as a Christian, living a life as a Christian, and, well, I never seem to encounter any resistance at all from the world. And what does that mean? Maybe it means that nobody really even realizes that I am a part of the church. Maybe nobody even realizes that I am not of the world. And if nobody even knows that, then what does it say about my faith? It's definitely something to consider, but it's not really the point that I want to drive at today. What I want to think about is the state of affairs in the world today. How acceptable is prayer today? Let's say in a forum like a public school. Now, we might say that prayer is perfectly well accepted, but, well, once I mention a public school, yeah, there are kind of some limits on that, aren't there? It's not really socially acceptable in the way that it once was. Let's look at another example, maybe one that's a bit more concrete. What would you think of maybe a monument or something that was being placed on public land, and we'll put something on it, I don't know, some writing, maybe an inscription, let's put the Ten Commandments on it. Would that be acceptable? Well, there are plenty of those monuments all over this country especially, and yet, well, they keep getting torn down, don't they? There have been a lot of people offended at that and seeking specifically to tear those down, to get rid of those religious symbols on the grounds that, well, it's public, there should be separation of church and state, which, by the way, is not a phrase that occurs in the United States Constitution, but that's a whole other discussion for another time. It's not really considered to be acceptable, even though it used to be all over the place, and it wasn't really even an attempt to it certainly wasn't an attempt to establish a state religion, but it was just a symbol of divine justice, and yet, well, they face challenge after challenge today. If you look back at history, you'll see that there have been many, many, many times that putatively Christian societies or cultures faced this kind of worldly reckoning. One example would be during the French Revolution. We're not going to go into all the history of the French Revolution, or we would be here for another couple of months, but there was a part of the French Revolution, and it wasn't just a side point, it was deeply embedded in the reasons for the French Revolution. And the term that was used for it, and the term that is still used to refer back to it, is de-Christianization. In place of Christianity, these French revolutionaries were putting forth a different religion, which went by various names. One would be the cult of the Supreme Being. What does that even mean? Well, Supreme Being, that sounds like it refers to God, and it sort of does, but we better not call him that, because that's just too, well, it's too Christian, and their objection is not exactly to God, our objection is to the Christian part. That's really the way it went. There was another form that this took, not the cult of the Supreme Being, but the cult of reason, where, once again, we're trying to, abstract it even further and not even call God a supreme being, but just refer to the supremacy of reason. It's an attempt to be atheistic. Of course, well, I don't know, as long as we're talking about John says in the beginning was the Word, the Logos, the divine logic of the universe. Logos is used to mean reason in Greek. Now, there's some reasons behind that. In the French Revolution, one of the reasons that it was happening was that the people broadly did not like the abuses of the Catholic Church. They did not like the Catholic Church telling people what to do, especially when it wasn't what God was telling them to do. So the idea was to, basically do all the same things that the Catholic Church was doing, except worse. I'm not clear on exactly how that was an improvement, but nevertheless, that was the thinking. It wasn't only the French Revolution where this sort of thing occurred. During the Russian Revolution, just over 100 years ago now, well, the Russian Orthodox Church encountered an awful lot of persecution in the course of that revolution. And the revolution led to a ban on religion in general, because, well, it was putatively a communist revolution, and the fundamental presupposition of communism is atheism. So, Of course, then they presented people like Vladimir Lenin as, messiahs, and then proceeded to murder and starve and rape and enslave millions over the ensuing decades. Oh yeah, sounds like the Christians were the real problem here, doesn't it? Not that the Russian Orthodox Church was perfect, certainly not, but what replaced it cannot be viably called an improvement. Getting a little bit closer to the modern day, think about the Chinese Cultural Revolution. Religion was banned. Places of worship were closed and or demolished. Now, later on, China sort of liberalized things liberalized things, to the extent that you're now allowed to be a Christian in China, or at least the CCP-approved version of a Christian, which is not the same thing. I have some friends who have been effectively banned from returning to China for the horrible offense of teaching the Bible there. And then we've got the latest installment. Early in December of last year, a woman in the UK named Isabel Spruce was arrested and charged with 4 counts of failing to comply with a public space protection order. What does that mean exactly? Well, what it means is that she was silently praying in her head while standing alone outside an abortion clinic. Either the police or the ones who brought the complaint to the police, I don't remember which, even took pictures of this lady standing outside the clinic, and the police later presented these pictures to her and had to ask her, "Are you praying in this picture?" And, she would give an answer to that, which is, I don't know, maybe I might have been. I mean, I pray sometimes, and other times I'm thinking about other things, sometimes I get distracted. Okay. Well, what about this picture? You praying in this picture? Isn't that bizarre? We've gotten to the point where it is considered against the law in some circumstances to pray in a Western country. You realize this means that the state is claiming jurisdiction not just over this person's body, but over her mind and her spirit. Do they have any authority to do such a thing? This is not the only example of such things happening in the UK. Similar things have happened in the US, although not to this extent. Yet. It's an awful lot like what Daniel faced, isn't it? In Daniel chapter 6, let's begin in verse 4. Then the high officials and the satraps fought to find a ground for complaint against Daniel with regard to the kingdom, but they could find no ground for complaint or any fault, because he was faithful, and no error or fault was found in him. Then these men said, "We shall not find any ground for complaint against this Daniel unless we find it in connection with the law of his God." Then these high officials and satraps came by agreement to the king and said to him, "O King Darius, live forever. All the high officials of the kingdom, the prefects and the satraps, the counselors and the governors, are agreed that the king should establish an ordinance and enforce an injunction that whoever makes petition to any god or man for 30 days, except to you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions. Now, O king, establish the injunction and sign the document so that it cannot be changed, according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be revoked." Therefore King Darius signed the document and injunction. When Daniel knew that the document had been signed, he went to his house, where he had windows in his upper chamber open toward Jerusalem. He got down on his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God, as he had done previously. So how did Daniel handle it? Well, he didn't let it change his behavior in the slightest. And let's note that this wasn't even Daniel saying, "Well, God has commanded me in his law to pray to him 3 times a day, and therefore I must do it." God actually hadn't commanded such a thing. And yet Daniel recognizes here that the law is encroaching upon an area of life that is completely outside of its jurisdiction. And he refuses to give it any credit. And instead, he goes right on and does what he has every right to do. He knows where this might lead. And in fact, he is caught because, of course, there are people who are out to get him, and they're specifically trying to, the whole reason this law was made was so they could get him. So, of course, they're surveilling him, and they find that he has done the thing, and so they bring the thing before the king. And even though the king really likes Daniel, well, you know the story, he still gets thrown into the den of lions. There's not a word of protest recorded from Daniel about this. There's no defiant, "You can't hurt me." It appears that he just took the same attitude about this as his friends had taken back in chapter 3, beginning in verse 17, when they were about to be thrown into a furnace for the crime of not bowing down and worshiping the state idol. Chapter 3, verses 17 and 18. "If this be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up." They say, "We recognize that God can save us, and maybe he will. But if he doesn't save us, don't care. We're still not going to do this, because it would be wrong." And it is never right to use an immoral means, an inherently immoral means, to bring about an end that we think is preferable. Daniel, as I said, takes the same approach, as far as we can tell. He just goes on about his life and allows himself to be taken into custody and punished by being thrown into the den of lions. Doesn't it seem like, well, I mean, certainly in the case of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, it was a public offense, but in Daniel's case, couldn't he have just, kind of hidden it? I mean, really, isn't that what Jesus tells us to do? In Matthew chapter 6, in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says, beginning of verse 5, "And when you pray, you must not be like the hypocrites, for they love to stand and pray in the synagogues and at the street corners, that they may be seen by others. Truly, I say to you, they have received their reward. But when you pray, go into your room and shut the door and pray to your Father who is in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you." Well, there you go. Jesus says to hide your praying. But context is everything. Textual context is extremely important, but on top of that, so is historical and social context. In that society into which Jesus was preaching at that moment, it was advantageous to be seen and heard praying to God. And so Jesus says if you're doing it for that reason, then, well, God's not going to give you anything for it. What about in Daniel's case? Was it advantageous personally to Daniel to be caught praying to God? Obviously not. They tried to kill him for it. Okay, now, what about in our society? Once upon a time, I might have said yes. Not anymore. There are still pockets, there are still some advantages that can come from it, but it's certainly fallen out of favor, and it's falling faster and faster. Well, maybe you're just dead set on misapplying what Jesus says here in Matthew 6, and you're going to go ahead and hide your prayers. Okay, fine, whatever. Was that enough to keep Daniel safe? It's not that he was deliberately hiding it, but he was doing it in the privacy of his own home, and that was not enough to keep him safe from persecution. What about this British lady? She was praying in the privacy of her own head, and it wasn't enough to protect her. Let's talk briefly about another recent story, another recent event in the culture. There's a fellow by the name of Damar Hamlin that comparatively few people had heard of just a couple of months ago, and now probably everybody knows his name. This guy, if you're not aware, is a football player with the Buffalo Bills, and he went into cardiac arrest on the field in the middle of the game on Monday, January 2nd. Now, about 165,000 people die every day worldwide. And yet this one guy's fight for his life somehow captured the attention of an entire nation. What happens when we see someone in obvious danger and we just can't do anything about it? We feel helpless. We obviously yearn to see not just justice, but we strive to see the situation play out the way that it should. In this case, we want to see this guy revived. We want to see this guy healed. We want to see this guy go back to a life of health. We want to see him restored to what he was before. There are a handful of doctors and whatnot, but the vast majority of the people who are following the story, there's nothing that I can tangibly do to help. So what did we do? The nation prayed. Both teams gathered on the field near Hamlin's motionless body and knelt in prayer. Fans prayed in the stadium. Other fans followed him to the hospital and prayed outside the hospital. Sportscasters prayed out loud on live TV and urged their audiences to do the same. Social media prayed. It was a wonderful thing to see. Now, in contrast to that, there's another name that you may or may not know, Joe Kennedy, also associated with football. This guy is a high school football coach in Washington State, and he was fired from his post in 2015 for the offense of praying on the field after each game, when students began to voluntarily join him. It took 7 years of court battles until finally getting up to the Supreme Court before it was finally determined that firing him was not the right call. What happened? What happened? Romans chapter 1. Let's read verses 19 and 20. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world, in the things that have been made. You see, man is inherently religious. When France went atheist in the 18th and 19th centuries, it didn't really go atheist, it just turned the state into a merciless and bloodthirsty God, indifferent to the suffering of the people it professed to liberate. When Russia went atheist in the early 20th century, it did exactly the same thing. Ditto for China in the mid-20th century, and continuing on to today. And increasingly, we are seeing this come back around to the West. Man is inherently religious. Man is even inherently superstitious, happy to suggest all sorts of addled spirituality mumbo-jumbo that leads to all sorts of craziness, like the Manson family, the Branch Davidians, and the more innocuously named Children of God, and Heaven's Gate, and People's Temple movements, and countless other innovative reruns of the same old nonsense, which usually boils down to either a doomsday prediction, a free love party, or a way to secure material wealth. And it always seems to lead to death and misery. So the objection isn't about religion. The objection in Joe Kennedy's case, the objection in Isabel Spruce's case, the objection from France and Russia and China, the objection to the Ten Commandments today. It's not about religion. It's not even about something like prayer broadly, because we were totally happy to pray for Damar Hamlin. No, the culture is specifically upset about Christ. And this shouldn't have been a surprise to us. After all, it was prophesied many hundreds of years ago in the book of Isaiah. Let's first look at chapter 28, verse 16. Therefore thus says the Lord God, Behold, I am the one who has laid as a foundation in Zion a stone, a tested stone, a precious cornerstone of a sure foundation. Whoever believes will not be in haste. That's talking about Christ. Christ is that cornerstone, the one who is planted on Zion. But if we go back to chapter 8, speaking of the same stone, he says in verse 14, And he will become a sanctuary and a stone of offense, and a rock of stumbling to both houses of Israel, a trap and a snare to the inhabitants of Jerusalem, and many shall stumble on it. They shall fall and be broken, they shall be snared and taken. Christ is a foundation stone, but he's also a stumbling block. And an awful lot of people are going to trip and fall over that stone. So, what am I getting at here? Am I saying that anybody who prays gets a pass? Well, no. I suspect that an awful lot of those people who were praying for Damar Hamlin have major misunderstandings or lead lives that are obviously headed for judgment. In fact, Paul says something about people who profess to be godly in 2 Timothy 3, But understand this, that in the last days there will come times of difficulty, for people will be lovers of self, lovers of money, proud, arrogant, abusive, disobedient to their parents, ungrateful, unholy, heartless, unappeasable, slanderous, without self-control, brutal, not loving good, treacherous, reckless, swollen with conceit, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, having the appearance of godliness, but denying its power. There are always going to be enemies of the cross of Christ. There are always going to be people who want to set up a different symbol, who want to set up an idol, who want to set up a false god to replace him. Philippians chapter 3 For many of whom I have often told you, and now tell you even with tears, walk as enemies of the cross of Christ. Their end is destruction, their God is their belly, and they glory in their shame with their minds set on earthly things. But our citizenship is in heaven, and from it we await a Savior, the Lord Jesus Christ, who will transform our lowly body to be like his glorious body, by the power that enables him even to subject all things to himself. Therefore, my brothers, whom I love and long for, my joy and crown, stand firm thus in the Lord, my beloved. I appeal to you today to pray. Pray silently, pray vocally, pray in secret, pray in public. Pray without either embarrassment or with desire to be seen and thought righteous. Praying reminds us that we're not so big. It reminds us that we're not in control of our own physical destiny. And it works the other way, too. We feel compelled to pray when events take place that demonstrate clearly to us that we are not in control. Really, isn't it better for us to maintain that kind of humility all the time? But while we are not in control of our physical destiny, we are, in some sense, in control of our spiritual destiny. We can behave righteously and live forever in glory, or we can transgress God's laws and die forever in agony. Of course, Romans 3:23, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. And Romans 3:10, as it is written, none is righteous, no, not one. So that's inconvenient. That doesn't look very good for us. But while we had no right even to appear before God to plead our case, to try to demonstrate rehabilitation, to beg for mercy, Christ opened up a pathway for us through his own death to provide us a more meaningful avenue of prayer to his Father. Hebrews chapter 10, let's begin in verse 19. Therefore, brothers, since we have confidence to enter the holy places by the blood of Jesus, by the new and living way that he opened for us through the curtain, that is, through his flesh, and since we have a great priest over the house of God, let us draw near with a true heart and full assurance of faith, with our hearts sprinkled clean from an evil conscience, and our bodies washed with pure water. Let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering, for he who promised is faithful. And let us consider how to stir up one another to love and good works, not neglecting to meet together as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near. If you need to draw near to him, if you need to confess your faith in him, if you need to have your heart and your body cleansed, we'd love to help. If you've fallen short in love, in good works, in attendance, in encouraging, and want to change that, we'd love to help. We don't know when that final day will be. But we know we're one day closer to it now than we were yesterday. Are you looking forward to it? Are you ready? Please get in touch with us. You can call or text us at 812-550-6234 or email us at info@riverridgechurch.org. You can also find us at 5600 Van Road in Newburgh. We gather at 9 a.m. every Sunday for Bible study, 10 a.m. and 4 p.m. for worship, and 7 p.m. on Wednesdays for another study. I'd love to see you there. Thanks for joining me today on Iron Sharpens Iron.